I thought, that's interesting. How do you make any money being an author? And her name kept coming up, and the fact that she was over here, but I'd never met her. And I'd never read anything that she'd written. At that time, I'd never read much of what anybody had ever written. My youth, growing up, was saturated with stories. But they weren't stories that I would sit down and read. And they weren't stories of once upon a time in a land far, far away. They were stories that my mother would tell me to entice me to go up to get into bed, and I'll be up and tell you a story. And it was a story of growing up in Penobscot, where she grew up, western Hancock County, and having the peddlers come through with their push carts and saving up rags or something to trade for some flatware. And later on, there was a peddler who came through, but he had a puddle jumper, which is what she called one of those first cars that came through town. And you had to be a little leery of him, apparently, and take stock of your cats and dogs and chickens after he left. She didn't say he was a thief, but I got that part. And then she used to tell about going down to the bars in the late afternoon to bring the cows up to the barn. It was quite a while after that I learned that you could go to bars in the late afternoon. And then my father would also tell me stories. And he grew up on the Reach. He was born on Egamogan Reach in Deer Isle and was a fisherman. And he would tell me stories about going with his grandfather, sailing up the Penobscot River to get a load of lumber in Bangor, and maybe waking up on the river and seeing the salmon jump in the morning. So those were stories. They were life stories, but they had an impact on me. And then, fast forward, I teach at the high school, or I taught at the high school. And in one of my classes that I had, this young fellow, who is a particularly dear friend of mine now, he comes up to me after class and he said, "Mr. Damon, my great aunt wrote a book I think you would like." And he handed me the hardcover copy of Cold as a Dog in the Wind Knows East. And I took it and put it in my briefcase and walked off to the next class, not wanting to tell him that I didn't read much. Still. A couple of weeks later, he said, "I'm going to need that book back." And I says, "Oh, Greg, I haven't quite finished it." That's how big it is. So that night, he shamed me into opening it for the first time. And a strange thing happened. As I started seeing words and reading them off a page, the sound of my parents telling their stories came from this book. That had never happened. So I was pretty taken with that, surprised by it. And before I gave the book back to Greg the next day in class, I said to the group, I've got a couple of stories in this book that I think you might like. And as in many classes, there were people who were very interested and people who could have cared less. And so those people who could have cared less usually sat in the back, and there were some groans. And I said, "All right, just don't ruin it for everybody else. Let's just hear this." And so I read one of the ballads. And even the group way in the back, and I'm not pointing to you particularly, said, "Hey, that was really pretty good." And so it was pretty good for me, and it was pretty good for them, and I think it's been pretty good for a lot of people. Moving on from that, I left teaching. Oh, actually, no. Before I left teaching, another of Ruth's great nephews, I think, conspired with my wife to have, as a Father's Day gift, a meeting with Ruth. I wasn't aware of what was happening, but it happened just down the road at Pearl and Louise's house. You perhaps know where that is. I was there, and Bunky was there, and I'm wondering what I'm doing, and all of a sudden she walks in. I didn't quite know what to say, but said hi anyway. And she the same, and we had a very brief conversation, and actually, it might have been, though I can't attest to this, it might have been when she endorsed this book, which says, to Dennis Damon, with all best wishes, Ruth Moore. That's her. Now I fast forward to have left teaching and working with a friend of mine in Northeast Harbor, and the days have changed immensely from being dictated by the bells at school of where you go and when, and so we were working in a kind of a contracting business and had an office, and this one Saturday, a former English teacher at the school who was a friend of mine sent me a note saying that there was going to be a talk on Ruth Moore in Bangor, and she thought that I might be interested. So I went up, and it happened to be Gary Lawless. Gary Lawless, who is, I see some nods, you know who he is. And he was giving a lecture about Ruth, and I think it was called Ruth Moore, Tongue of Granite, Tongue of Salt, something like that. And as I'm sitting there soaking this all in, I got the damnedest feeling that I know all this that he was talking about. I didn't, but it felt like I did. And I couldn't get it out of my head, and I drove back home. That was Saturday. Sunday, I'm still with it. Monday. Finally, Tuesday, I think it was, I was in the office. And I said, I've got to talk with her. How do I do that? People had warned me about trying to get in touch with her because she could apparently be somewhat gruff. And I don't know. I didn't know where she lived. I didn't know what her phone number was. And so I looked in the phone book, and I found an M. Moore with a 244 number. That would be for the quiet side. And I called it. And this voice picked up, this phone picked up, and the voice says, hello? And I said, hi, I'm trying to reach Ruth Moore. This is, excuse me, this must be the coffee. This is she. Kind of, I said, oh, I didn't know she was going to answer her own phone. I didn't know if that was her to begin with. I didn't know she was going to answer her own phone. Caught me off guard, you know. I said, oh, my name's Dennis Damon. Oh, so it is. Entirely changed. What can I do for you? And I said, well, I'm calling to see if I might be able to come and visit with you. Oh, I'd love that. You would? So I think it was on a Tuesday, could have been a Wednesday. I didn't want to be too forward, and so I'm thinking, well, maybe Friday. And so I says, could I come over Friday? Oh dear, Friday's not good. I got to go to the doctor. This cussed foot's acting up again, just as if I knew she had a foot problem. And so I said, well, I'm thinking I better move it past the weekend and go to Monday, though I didn't want to. And she said, I tell you what, can you come over today at 1? I think that was 11 that I called, sometime before 11. So, could I? Well, yes, I could, and I did. And I showed up at her door. I guess I'd found out where she lived, or approximately where she lived. I showed up at her door, came in through kind of the pantry into the kitchen. Now, I have a picture. I'm not going to pass it around, but I'll show it to you afterwards if you want to. The kitchen was very clean, immaculate, in fact. I think there was an end burner, and I don't know if it was wood or coal or oil, and there was another stove. But I think a realtor would probably classify it as being functionally obsolescent, in that the stuff was old, but it was still clean, it's still neat. We walk through there, and we go into the living room. And the living room is in my mind's eye now, was all wood. I think the ceiling was wood, the floor was wood, and the walls were all bookcases. She had a chair, a red Naugahyde chair in a corner, that the seat was pretty well used. On one side of it, there was a little side table that was piled high with books. I don't think she was storing them there. I think she was probably reading them. On the other side, there was another side table, almost the entire top taken up with the biggest ashtray you've ever seen, and perhaps never emptied. There was a pile of gray ashes and a whole bunch of, I think they might have been Pall Malls or something. They weren't menthol, stuffed in all around it. She had, they weren't dungarees, but they were denim pants. She had a red chamois shirt open at the neck, revealing a white t-shirt or undershirt, white hair, a lot of wrinkles, and steely, steely eyes. If they locked on you, it was either great affection or great worry. She sat in that chair, beckoned for me to sit across this braided oval rug that was on the floor, and I can remember that there was red in it. And I sat in another chair. I no sooner sat down than the eyes looked at me, and she said, "So, what do you want?" Well, Jesus, I didn't know how to tell her this. I only wanted to be in her presence for just a couple of minutes, if I could. And so I felt this redness creeping up under my collar and being quite uncomfortable. And I don't know who started it, but there was a story that she told, and I told another one, and she told another, and back and forth. I got there at 1 o'clock, remember? I thought if I could have a half an hour with her, that would be great. When I looked at my watch, it was almost 4. I said, "Oh, dear Ruth, I'm really sorry, but I have an appointment that I have to get to." And she said, "And so I'm going to have to leave." And she said, "Well, I'm sorry too. You suppose you can come back?" And I did on numerous occasions. One, she started me reading. I blamed her for this when she was still alive. And she said, "Now, dear, that's not a bad thing." So I thought that I would read her novels from beginning to end through the way they were written. And I had held on to this that I had years before, and I wanted and wanted and wanted to tell her one of her ballads. So I'd go there specifically. All right, I'm going to tell her one of her ballads, and I wouldn't get the courage, the nerve. But I finally did. She said, "Would you do that?" And I said, "I would love to." "Yeah, would I? I've been dying to. I'd love to." So I left my chair that I would take, and I crossed over the rug, and I sat on the floor in front of her. And I did the following ballad. Now, I don't want to put any pressure on you, but at the end of this telling of her ballad, she sat there. She looked down at me. She put her hands together. It wasn't an applause. She was rubbing them. Took a deep breath, looked down and said, "That's the way I wrote it." So Charlie had a heron where it was down to Bailey's Bite. He got up to tend it in the middle of the night. It was late October, midnight, black as tar. Nothing out the window but big cold star. House was like a cemetery. Kitchen fire was dead. "I'm damn good mind," says Charlie, "to go right back to bed. But a man who runs a heron ware, even on the side, is nothing but a slave to the goddamn tide. Well, a man feels meager and a man feels old in that pitch black midnight, lonesome and cold, with chills in his stomach like 40,000 mice, and the very buttons on his pants like little lumps of ice. Times he gets to feeling it's no damn use." So Charlie had a pitcher full in his orange juice. Then he felt better than he had before, so he had another pitcher full, just to last him to the shore. Well, down by the beach rocks, underneath a tree, Charlie saw something that he never thought he'd see. For sparkling in the lantern light as he went to pass was 3 big diamonds in the frosty grass. says Charlie. Says Charlie. Diamonds, where'd they come from? Geese, where'd they come from? I think I'll pick them up later on. You know, I always wanted some. Then he hauled in his dory, and she felt light as air. And in the dark midnight, Charlie rode off to tend the weir. Well, out by the weir gate, Charlie found an old sea serpent swimming round and round, had a head like a washtub, whiskers like thatch, and the breath like the flame on a Portland star match. Black in the lantern light, up he rose with a great big barnacle on the end of his nose, and he looked Charlie over, kind of surly and cross, and said, "Hey, them fish you got shut up in there belongs to my boss." "Fish?" says Charlie. "Fish? In there? Well, I ain't caught a fish since I built the damn whale." "Well," says the sea serpent, "nevertheless, there's 10,000 bushels at a rough guess." So Charlie moved his lantern, and he gave his oars a pull, and he saw that the whale was brimming belly full. There was fish rising out of the water, 1,000,000,000,000 at a time, and the side of each and every one was like a silver dime. "Well," says the sea serpent, "what you going to do? They're uncomfortable, they don't belong to you, so open this contraption up and let them go. Come on, shake the lead out. The boss says so." "Oh, he does," says Charlie. "Well, who the hell is he? Thinks he can sit back and send word to me." Sea serpent Twizzle made a water spout. Says, "You keep on, brother, and you'll find out." But Charlie says, "You're nothing but a lie, so hold your hoary. So get your dirty whiskers off the gunwale of my dory." Sea serpent Twizzle heaved underneath, spun back a set of sharp yellow teeth, and he came at Charlie with a gurgly roar. Well, Charlie let him have it with the port side oar. Right on the noggin. Oh, 'twas a hell of a knock. And the old sea serpent sank like a rock. "So go on back," yells Charlie, "and tell that old jerk not to send a boy to do a man's work." Then over by the weir gate, kind of tinkly and clear, a pretty little voice says, "Yoo-hoo, Charlie dear." "Now what?" says Charlie. "This ain't funny." And the same sweet voice said, "Yoo-hoo, Charlie honey." And there on the same pole, right in the weir, was a little green mermaid combing out her hair. "All right," says Charlie, "I know who you come from, and you get too." So he let fly his bailing scoop, and it landed with a clunk. And when the water had settled, by the mermaid, she'd sunk. But then the ocean moved behind him with a mighty heave and a hiss, and a thundery, rumbly voice remarked, "I'm goddamn sick of this." And up come an old man, white from top to toe, whiter than the daisy fields, whiter than the snow, carrying a pitchfork with 3 tines on it, muttering in his whiskers and madder'n a hornet. "My sea serpent's so lame that he can hardly stir, and my best mermaid, you've raised a lump on her, and you've been pretty sassy calling me a jerk. So now the old man has come to do the man's work." Well, says Charlie, "why don't you leave me be? Because you may be the hoary old man of the sea, but I got to run a fish here, shut up inside, and if you keep on frigging around, you're going to make me lose this tide." Next thing that Charlie knew, he was lying on the sand. The painter of his dory was right beside his hand. He could see out across the bay, and it was all calm and still and wide, and it was full daylight, and it was high tide. "Oh," he thought, "what am I about?" Because the oars weren't wet, so he hadn't been out. "Oh," he thought, "diamonds underneath the tree. Seems to me I found some. Guess I better go and see." He couldn't find any. Not one gem. You see, there was only 3 little owl dungs with frost on them. No, that's all right. Well, I'll come to expect it. Don't do that. You know, I'm assuming, since you're here, that you at least read some of what she's written, whether it be novels or ballads or whatever, or essays. I was looking, by the way, in your little synopsis, and one of my favorite essays of hers was Soldier Shows His Mettle. I don't know if you have read it or not, but I don't know where you'd find it. I guess you can find anything now that you look for it, but it's just another example of her talent. I'm always impressed by talent, and I don't know if genius is too strong, but in that book, Cold as a Dog in the Wind Northeast, there's a prologue, and I think in it is the essence of creativity, of imagination, of storytelling, and she's a little self-effacing at the end. It goes something, but probably not exactly like this. I once see a whale with a gold tooth, and he riz right out of the sea. And he opened his mouth in the morning sun, and he showed that tooth to me. And once, when I was fishing the deep ground with nigh 6 pounds of lead, I caught a cod, big as a man, and it had a man's head. Oh, there ain't no end to what I'd tell once I was well begun. Like seeing the devil rise from the sea instead of the rising sun. Like sea snakes lashing the moonlit sea with their terrible lollipins. And little mermaids with diamond eyes, solid silver fins. For some have eyes to see strange sights, and such a one I be. But I'm not known as an honest man, and nobody harks to me. Well, they do hark to you, Ruth, and they did, and they still do, these 119 years later. Before I turn it over to you to grill me with questions, if you have any, I wanted to share a couple more ballads, if you don't mind, and even if you do mind. There's one called the Ballad of Long-Gone Jones. He's described, she describes him as being wrinkled like a salted hake and bearded like a tree. That line I couldn't get out of my head after meeting her. Though she didn't have a beard, she was wrinkled like a salted hake. And I know that the cod he ate their eyeballs out these 20 years agone, and the halibut rolls above the poles that they hung their hammocks on. But wrinkled like a salted hake and bearded like a tree, Long-Gone Jones come back to land that he never thought he'd see. I only seen horizons for 20 years, said he. I'll tell you here and now just how that came to be. I was standing trick with Windy Hill of a clear night, said he. So clear I see a petrel fly between the moon and me. The ship was sailing sweet, soft and sweet, like a lady about to sing. When I looked away to the leeward side, and I see a peculiar thing. Now I never see such a curious thing in all my years at sea. For here come a fog bank, blowing in, against what wind there be. Before I so much as spit on my thumb to feel what ailed the breeze, the vessel slid into that bank of fog like a maggot into cheese. Get that in your head. We gawped at the rigging lights go out, as if they'd been doused in milk, and Windy's hair crept up on his head with a sound like rustling silk. For a minute I breathed them fog drops in, a-thinking, what can this be? I couldn't sing out to Windy Hill, and he didn't sing out to me. And then I smelt to the east, and I smelt to the west, like you do when it's thick of fog. And all of a sudden I smelt green fields and the sun on a cranberry bog. And out of the maw an island come, like a ship a-sailing by. Her bow was made of a granite cliff, it was 100 fathoms high. and the monstrous wave from her forefoot, why, it riz us to the sky. We felt the vessel starting up, and Windy spoke with a croak. Missed us, by God, said Windy Hill. But that was the last he spoke. And as I saw that bow wave roll against the milky moon, the honest thought come to my head that he had spoke too soon. We roared straight up through that bank of fog into the moonlight, white as wine, and I looked around and I see the stars and the icy cold sky shine. The comets out of the Milky Way come flicking the vessel's spars, and I see the earth like a rubber ball down there amongst them stars. I see the moon like a big cartwheel, and I touched her as I went by. And if you ever want to know what the moon feels like, she feels like a haddock's eye. And then all of a sudden we hit the top and we started whirling blind, and all the rags of all the sails went streaming out behind. Thinks I, when she drops, she'll hit the sea like a rock hove into a well. So I better jump, and so I jumped, and bless my dear heart, how I fell. I see the earth come up to me, calm in the moonlit night, with the ocean as wide as the wide, wide world, a-waiting for me to light. And there in the middle of all that sea, bone white like a damn great tray, was that fog bank, set in and bubbling in a most peculiar way. And I lit with a monstrous crashing thump that nigh unshackled me, but it wasn't the ocean I landed in, it was the top of an elm tree. And it come to me like a blast of light, as clear as a boiling spring, that I lit like a bird on that island that had started the whole damn thing. And then I heard a terrible moaning sound, like the gale in a vessel's spars, and I see the ship come whirling down between the moon and stars. And she struck the sea with a scattering crash, and smashed like a china cup. No Sorry Bill, no Windy Hill, no Salvador come up. Well, I peeked through the tree at the island's bow, and there was a binnacle light, and a monstrous great wheel, and a compass box, and a critter taking a sight. And I see one half of a cloven foot, and I knowed who it was, all right. Now, that voyage I begun that night went on for 20 year and more. We sailed all over the seas there be, and we never come to shore. We sailed all over the seas there be, on mischief and murder bent. And if you hear about ships as never come back, why, I know where them vessels went. And how did I come ashore, says you? Says you, for here I be. One night we had a hell of a storm, and that island sunk, said he. Seems so hard to me that a man who was all but born in a boat should, of course, make his living out of the sea. But every winter, when work was slack and he ought to be fixing his traps and boat, he'd sit with that seed book under his nose until I could have jumped right down his throat. And before the frost was out in the spring, he'd be digging down on his knees. Ike, I'd say, it's a fool thing. You can't grow nothing on rocks like these. Why, even the trees is sprouted out because the roots hit rocks and they won't go down. And there ain't much use in garden truck where goosegrass, even in June, goes brown. But he never give no heed to me. He was as sot in his ways as a hen. But God never meant this place to grow. And so I told him over and again, but every spring for, I knew this was going to happen. What's the one I'm doing here now? Wait just a minute. It'll come to me. But every spring, I was right, but every spring for 20 years he dug like he'd a kind of a craze. Why, the money he'd spent on seeds and stuff would have kept him in oil pants all of his days. Last year, he got him some good black earth, dug up from a farm in on the land. Like to lugged himself to death, spreading it onto the rocks by hand. But all of his seeds, they come up and they grow as greens of stuff you'd raise in a can. Ike was as proud as a pint of milk. I never see such a change in a man, but I done my darndest. Ike, I'd say, weather's brewing. Don't you forget we'll have a tempest before we're through. We ain't had a season without one yet. But he was stepping clean off the ground. Never could see beyond his nose. Oh, I got a lick this year, he says, 'cause under them rocks, the roots grows. Well, it come in August. The gulls flew up and made it, the sun rose like, it come in August. The sun rose red as a kilt pig for a couple of days, and the gulls flew up and made a touse and took the land, and there, I says. We ain't had a storm like that for years. It's a wonder I'm even here to tell the tale. I thought the lighthouse was pounding down, the sea made so, and it blew such a gale. I went to bed, but I never slept. There was 4 windows that blew in the eastern rooms. And in the morning, them rocks was swept, like the angels of God had been there with their brooms. Ike, he opened the kitchen door, and he stood there mumbling under his breath. Look, I says, it's mess enough without you acting like we've had a death. Over and over again, I said it won't grow, just ain't God's will. He spun around like a crazy man. God Almighty, he says, keep still. You and God, he says, is done. I've stood this wrangling till I'm a wreck. Blast you, and blast God, and blast this sea. You shut up, I'll break your goddamn neck. Then he scrambled all of his seeds into an old tin pail with nary another word to me. I supposed he was going out like he usually did to heave rocks and cuss at the sea. So I said, if you're going out in this, you better put on your hat and coat. But he slammed the door. And the next thing I knew, I heard the engine starting his boat. Well, my heart come up and I run upstairs and I pointed the spyglass out over the trees. And there was his boat, right off the land. Oh, 'twas horrid the way she clumb them seas. Water rolling over the bow, and there stood Ike, his pail in hand, right in the face and the eyes of God, sowing seeds like you do on land. I won't forget till my dying day. Not till they lay me out in my winding sheet. Ike planting seeds in the bay with his boat sinking under his feet. I figured to go inshore this fall. It's kind of lonesome living alone. I could have felt that he was nearby if he'd been buried under a stone. But my brothers died and left me a farm. The letter said there was hens and a cow. I guess I can raise garden truck to sell and I'll manage to live somehow. A lot of irony in it. All right. This is about 2 brothers. Though they're biological brothers, one is as different from the other as could be, night and day. One's very self-reliant, the other one's very needy. I was told in the story, I wish I could remember which one speaks. I've told it 100, no more than that times, but I don't know which one is the narrator until it comes up in the story. But one is called Jap, which maybe is short for Jasper, and the other one is called, I hope I remember it sometime, something else, which is short for something else. And apparently there were 2 brothers who may be in the cemetery up at the head of the harbor. Do you know the ones I'm talking about? No. Neither of you. I'm looking for help. Okay. All right. This is called the Ballad of 3 Green Waves. That's bugged me. I got to find out what the other guy's name is. Hen. Jap and Hen. Jap, perhaps short for Jasper. Hen, short for chicken. Henry. This is the Ballad of 3 Green Waves. No, I ain't got no dory mate. See, I goes by myself, alone. I I can't stand nobody gomming around anything's my own. I ain't married. I never will. I comes when I likes, and I goes. Oh, folks and fussin' very well for them that likes 'em so, but when I puts out to haul my traps in a good rip-stavin' sea, there ain't a soul on the face of this earth worryin' after me. There was my brother, years ago. Got him a wife and a kid. He worried and wore himself plumb out, being easy in what he did. I remember we was hauling traps outside one time. Come on, a howling blow. Cold as a dog, and the wind no these, thickened tow with snow. Them was the days we fished with sails. You see, there weren't no engines then. I had a peapod and steered with an oar, but that wasn't enough for him. Now he had a dory rigged up with a mast and a mainsail without no jib, so's he could sit in the stern and steer with that tiller hugged in his rib. Well, the wind was coming, and Hen shoots up, one eye on the line of foam. "Jap!" he yells. "What in the hell I do? I've left my compass to home." Thinks I to myself, "Goddamn fool, you're all rigged up like a bloomin' yacht. You've been so blasted cat." Well, I hove him mine. "Catch!" I says, and he caught. But Hen wasn't no good when it come to fog. The snow squalls thicker than sin. But I'd never seen the rampaging yet that I could lose my bearings in. Down she come, and she was a bitch. And I squat on the end of my oar, and I headed into her just as I could and let her roar. I wasn't troubled. What'd I care? I never had no wife. And as for dying, well, there's them that's troubled all their life. "Holler, you damned old slut," I says. "Holler and bust your lungs. And if I get scared of your goings on," says I, "may I be hung." Then I sung all the hymn tunes that I ever knowed, because that's the kind you can roar. I never did hear a word I sung, but my throat got kind of sore. And I looked behind. I sees 3 green waves following fast as sin, each of them reaching his whiskers out to grab and rustle me in. Thinks I to myself, if them catches me, glory, amen, amen. Why, this fish will have a good feed tonight. Revive us again and again. The first one was dark and deep and smooth as a coffee cup. The next one was a slash of foam like a kettle boiling up. That last one was the whole green sea. He had a wicked eye and slobbering jaws, and he's the one's longing for me, thinks I. So I spits out over the peapod stern, and I turns my back on the sea, and in a minute I feels the rise of that first one under me. That first one lifted us up, soft as a sea of oil. The next one bit at me going by, and I could see its innards boil. 6 fathom deep in the trough he made, I looks through that glass green sea, clear as a bell through that last wave as was cowering over me. Then the bare black bottom spread beneath for miles and miles around. And school on school of big sea fish looked up without a sound. Their eyes were buttons off dead men's coats, all shiny and cold and still. And the first time ever in all my life, I felt my innards chill. For whilst I was looking, down come Hen, sunk like a chunk of lead. Oh, he was as large as life and as natural. Only I seen that he was dead. And them big sea fish swayed aside with a little swirl and swish, and then I never see Hen no more, only the backs to them fish. And the snake weeds was waving up and down, their ends all crimped and curled. You know, the trough between 2 big he waves is the stillest place in the world. But then foam was in my mouth like hair and howling in my ears, and I swum the middle of that there wave for 100,000 years, till I bumped my head on the back shore beach, spewed up like a goddamn pill, and that old wave went reeling back, laughing fit to kill. dories made to stand the seas of most any kind of gale. But all that we ever found of hen was the top to his dinner pail. But I maintained then, and I maintained now, that hen would have saved his life if his mind had been on steering his boat instead of on his wife. Oh, if anything ever come to me, says hen, what would my poor wife do? I never cared a hoot in hell, by gory, and I come through. Oh, so when I goes alone, through fire and water and paint. And I ain't got a soul to worry about me. And I don't care if I ain't. Some of them are soft endings, you see. You have to think about it. That's all right. You have been very patient, and I have really enjoyed this, except for the parts where I couldn't remember. That really bothers me some, but it's been a long time. It's been a long time. But maybe we could, you could ask me some questions. All right, great. Yes.
Do you write?
In the closet sometimes. Nothing. I tell you what, that's a good question because while I get to that, I was talking with her later in our meetings in the living room, and she was getting calls from various magazines and questions and interviews and everything like that, and she said, you know, all this newfound attention, you know what I'm doing now? And I said, no, what? She said, well, I've started writing again. Oh, she told me early on that she had stopped writing because she had just lost her partner and best friend, and she said, I've lost my guts. That was her words. But then she comes back and tells me, I've started writing again, and I hearken back to her advice, and I said, now, Ruth, that's not a bad thing. But no, I did something really out of the ordinary for me. Some time ago, there was a writing group in Southwest, primarily a women's writing group, but there was another guy in it, so I wasn't. And Candace Stover, I don't know if anybody knows her. She asked me if I would like to join it, and I said, well, no, I don't do any of that stuff. And she said, well, you have this particular writing group, you have permission to write anything, good, bad, indifferent. There's no critiquing, there's nothing else. It's just a matter of expression. And I said, well, if we're not grading it, sure, I'll try it. And so I went, terrified, the first night. The second night of the week, my youngest and that time only surviving brother was having a surgical procedure in Boston, and I was coming back from Washington, and so I surprised him by being at the hospital to be with him. And the day I stayed overnight, and that next morning he went into surgery, and I had to come back because at that point I was a county commissioner and I had some stupid something to do. Well, the short of it was that he didn't make it through the surgery. He made it through the surgery, but then he died. Surgery was a success, but the patient died. And so I missed that second group. I came back that third week, and it allowed me an opportunity to express a lot of the things that I hadn't spoken about. And I found out how valuable that writing experience was and could be. I stayed with that for a number of weeks and actually found the notebook that I had, and there's just little vignettes because it was a timed writing thing. You might have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you'd have a prompt, and who knows where that would go once you started. Oh, I guess one of the rules was once you start writing, you can't take the pen off, or the paper off, pen from the paper. Just, it's almost like extemporaneous thought. And it was really interesting at some of the things that came out. my two younger children, who are not so young, for Father's Day, gave me a, I don't know what you would call it. I guess they called it a gift. I'm calling it a burden. But you're supposed to write your memoirs each week and send them to this company, and eventually they put a hardcover on it. And I guess you can have more done if you want, and I was just providing for the kids. But kind of long answer, no, I don't really write that much. But thanks. Any others? And it's good to see you too, by the way.
So, did you teach English and literature in high school?
No, I stayed as far away from that as I could. That's an interesting one too. I get that a lot. No, actually, I was a phys ed major in college, and you had to have a double major, and so I majored in biology and phys ed. And I thought at some point that I might want to go into medicine. I was thinking dentistry, but then I thought, well, how are you going to get those hands in somebody's mouth? Then I ended up teaching a lot of other things, social studies and driver education and a bunch of things that people didn't want to teach. But that, I guess it might appear to some who don't know me that maybe I'm smarter than I am, but I'm not.
So it was a student that turned you on to the
Turned me on to her writing.
Yes.
I had known about her,
Yes.
but great Greg, of course you know, and then Bunky set up the meeting at Louise's house, and then it just naturally evolved in terms of the stories. That day when I went in and sat down, I didn't know what I was going to say, and there was some story, and I repeated one, and all of a sudden we had a lot. I can remember one of the times we were talking about words. My parents were a lot older than me when I was born. Everybody probably were, but mine were really a lot. I think Mom was 45 and Dad was 46, and I was the last of six. Six, yeah. And so there were old words in my house that were just common, and there were old words in her house. And so I was bringing some to her, and she was bringing some to me. And one that I remembered was an ot dish. Now, I would think I would spell it O-G-H-T or something. I don't know what I'd spell it. But it was a real triangular shaped dish that you would put in the sink that had holes in the bottom of it. And so if you were peeling vegetables or something, you'd peel the vegetable, and then you'd take them out to the chickens. And she smiled and knew all about that. I was reading that very night, I was reading Seaflower. And there was a passage in there about taking the orts, O-R-T-S. I'd always heard it as ox for some reason. I don't know why. But they were taking the orts out to the chickens, just as my mother had told me that we were taking the orts to the chickens. So those were the kind of, that's one that I remember, but there were other words too. So there was an understanding, I think. There wasn't any pretenses, which I'm sure that she appreciated, and I know that I did. It was just a very natural feeling. In fact, I was in Massachusetts when she passed. I had seen her a day or two before that when she was at not Sonergy, but the one Summit House. And I went in there to visit her. It was the end of November, and I had found some paintings, some cards. They were about the size of this book, and they were by Georgia O'Keeffe. And she and I had been talking about artists, and I liked Georgia O'Keeffe, and so did she. And so there were 6 or 8 of these reprinted things, and I brought them into her. And I looked around, and the walls were all just antiseptic, and they were plain. And I said, we ought to put some of these up. Oh dear, I don't think they allow that in here. They're pretty strict. And so we talked for a while, and then eventually a nurse or someone came and said, it's time for supper. And so they took her down to where everybody was eating, and I got a hold of that nurse, and I said, is there any way, we won't put thumbtacks up, but can we just put these up so that when she comes back, she can see them? And the nurse said, well, I don't think there's any real problem with that, so we put them up just so that she would have something. And I'm walking down the corridor to leave the facility, and on my left, the door is open, and it goes into a bigger room area, and the people who are staying there are all at these tables, and she's at a table with some other people, kind of looking down. And I just couldn't walk away, so I came back, and I came up kind of behind her a little bit. She didn't know I was there. And I said, Ruth, I'm going to leave now, but it was nice talking with you again. Yep, it was good for me too. Kind of fumbling about what to say, and I said, Ruth, I love you. She looked back and said, same. That was the last.
Wow.
I mean, she died a couple of days after that. My point was, I was down at a friend's house in Massachusetts, and Bonnie called me to tell me of her passing, and I called Esther and to tell her my sorrows and everything, and find out if there were any plans. And she said, and I told her I would be there now, but I'm in Massachusetts. You're calling all the way from Massachusetts? I said, yeah. Oh, that's awful good of you. She said, we're not going to do anything now. Ground's hardening up, but in the spring, we'll do something. And I'd like to have you be a part of it if you can. I said, of course, I'll do anything that you want. So one of the things that I did, I don't know if it's still there, it was in the garden. Anyway, I got a stone from the shore, from the marge between the land and the sea, which is tying it together for her. It was big enough I could barely, I was more able then, I could lift it. But we had a brass plaque that we put on it, and the inscription under it was, I have seen horizons. And I don't know if you found it or someone did, but it was apparently in one of her later writing pieces.
Was in her typewriter when she was fat when she died.
It was in her typewriter? I have seen horizons. And I remember in part of the eulogy, the gift was not that she had seen them, the gift that was she had us see them too. I think that was an appropriate epitaph. I know that they found in her journals, they found an epitaph that she perhaps had wanted to say at some point, because there were times in her life that she felt as though she was either misunderstood or, it's a word that I'm looking for, kind of taken advantage of, or people were taking liberties with what they thought they knew of her and her life. And so it went something like this. Reader/mourner, pass, nor stop to waste your time on sad biography and bitter rhyme. For what I am, this heavy rock ensures, and what I was is no affair of yours. Any other? Yeah, it was. Yeah, I wish I could write. I'd do that. Any other questions? Well, if they come to you and you want to, I'll be around. We're gonna have something to eat.
Yes, I think we'll cut the cake.
I don't
and
even
help
know.
yourself to
I
some
don't even
wine.
know what time it is. So
7:50.
And it's
It's not raining.
that's not too bad, and it's not raining.
Yeah.
It held off. All right.
Just for you.
Yeah, no, just for you and just for her. Thank you, Ruth.